You know, I do a lot of speaking, but Falmouth Public Library has become absolutely one of my very, very favorite places to visit. Jill has been such a great host. She's wonderful staff at the library. So it's a pleasure, truly, to be with you all tonight. And I understand this is a wonderful day at the library because Jill tells me that the library is reopening in person. So that is such welcome news. I think everybody is just so ready for that. And I can't wait to visit again in person. As Jill said, I know, I wish, as like you all do, that we were doing this in person tonight. I don't even mind the drive down. Believe me, I really don't. I really don't. So I wish it was in person, but we'll do the next best thing. Okay, for the next 60 minutes, I'm going to take you on a lightning quick tour around New England and introduce you to some stuff that's not in any of my books, some of my favorite people, some of my favorite places, some of my favorite foods, some of my favorite diners. And I'm going to share all that with you in just under an hour. Few surprises. I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So as Jill said, be sure if you have a question, put it in the chat. We'll get to it in 60 minutes. And with that, I'm going to jump in. So, you know, I always like to put it in terms of New England being like a iconic, famous restaurant, because iconic, famous restaurants are all usually famous for something, right? They're defined by like a signature dish. So I always like to say, like, if you're thinking about New England, what would New England's signature dishes be? Certainly we're talking Cape Cod, but a lot of the rest of New England, we're talking about the ocean. That is not something that defines every region of the country. And what makes New England unique in the sense that only one other region in addition to New England in the entire country has this is the mountains, right? The mountains you have in Maine coming down to the ocean. The only other region in the country that has that type of topography is the Pacific Northwest. And when it comes to New England, I would say history is a defining characteristic in terms of obviously native settlement, thousands, tens of thousands of years, possibly long, long before European settlement. However, New England does boast of the longest continuous European settlement. And when you go, just to beat that restaurant metaphor to death for a moment, you talk about restaurants with famous signature dishes, also often having famous sides, right? Side dishes. And I would say, when it comes to famous sides in New England, if we were using that metaphor, I would say for me, maybe you have some thoughts of your own, but I would say politics, certainly Boston, famous for it. Sports, few regions in the country really have the same hold with their teams that New England does, after all. And in this case, an actual food, because not every region of the country has a famous regional cuisine that they're not only famous for, that the people travel from all over the country, all over the world to have. And that's true of New England. It's certainly true of the Cape. Seafood, right? And extra credit if you know that the gentleman in the natty fedora is none other than Boston's famous rogue mayor, James Michael Curley. I think that number 6, famous Celtics Hall of Fame center Bill Russell needs no introduction. And for that matter, neither does the lobster. Although I throw that in because it's actually a different shellfish that we're going to be going to in just a moment for making one part of our first stop very famous, but a different shellfish. So with that, I would also point out food is rarely far from my stops when I travel around New England. I always say it's a wonder I don't weigh 1,000 pounds by now, but it's one particular kind of food, right? If you're familiar at all with some of my travels for our Main Streets and Back Roads series, not so much about like big, expensive, fancy food, but more about authentic comfort food as exemplified by the classic New England diner. So I'm going to share with you some of my favorite diners too tonight. In terms of where we're going, so you don't have to ask, reasonable question though. Here you go. Here's our compass headings. We're going to start and finish in Boston. We're going to start out by heading north up through the North Shore of Massachusetts. Then we're going to continue north into Maine. We're going to go west into New Hampshire. We're going to go further west into the Green Mountains of Vermont. We're going to come back south. We're going to come back into Massachusetts through the Berkshires. And then we're going to have a few surprises and mix it up a little before we finish up. And with that, I hope everybody's comfortable. Hope you have your feet up. Hope you have a nice cold or hot drink. I have I drink 2 of these a day. I really shouldn't, but ice mocha, Dunkin' Donuts. There you go. We all have our little vices. So with that, we're off. So starting with the North Shore, I probably know a little bit more about the North Shore than any other part of New England until I was 18, more than any other part of the world, because that's where I lived until I was 18, which was little town of Winthrop, or as I like to refer to it, the charming little seaside town at the end of runway 27L. It was a very noisy childhood growing up next to Logan Airport, as you can imagine. Gateway to the North Shore is what I call Winthrop, because Winthrop is curiously, Winthrop is to the North Shore what Quincy is to the South Shore, which is to say, they're not really on either shore. They just kind of stick out in the harbor, but their respective shores continue south of them, or in Winthrop's case, north of them. If you ever see a picture like this of Winthrop, where there's a good amount of sky showing, kind of a panoramic picture, look closely, because you'll definitely see at least one plane somewhere in the near or middle distance. And if you look really closely, you'll often see 2, 3, 4, 5, or even half a dozen, depending on the time of day and how much they're backed up, because the airplanes land every 18 to 21 seconds over Winthrop. Thank goodness they've gotten quieter since I grew up there. I remember growing up, like in junior high school, the planes could be so loud, they'd shake the room, right? Because at that point, you're less than half a mile from the runway. And teachers would just routinely just stop talking for a moment like that, you know? And you just got used to it. But it seems bizarre now, right? It seems crazy now. So I had some fun with some arrows here. You can see my boyhood home, pretty much. In the Highlands section of Winthrop, you see a plane taking off. And you see the field where I play baseball, which is in the Point Shirley section of Winthrop, which is the little point that sticks out, which is actually the closest part of Winthrop to a runway at Logan Airport, less than a 16th of a mile at that point. I used to swear I could see people's faces in the landing airplanes waving. I think I probably imagined that. But as you can see, the runway pattern, insanely close to a hugely congested Winthrop. 1 square mile, it's the most densely populated town in Massachusetts. You could never build an international airport that close to an urban area today. But when they built Logan in 1920s, they were only landing and taking off single engine prop planes, delivering mail to New York and Philadelphia. So jets weren't really an issue. And with that, we are off to the other Cape. You know, I have some fun with this every time I give this talk, because I like to point out to people there are 2 Capes in Massachusetts. Now, you are on Cape number 1, because it's the only Cape that doesn't need any specification. You know, if you say on Friday afternoon to somebody, I'm heading to the Cape for the weekend, no one in recorded history has ever followed that with, oh, which Cape, right? Never happened. There's no recording of that in history. However, there are 2 Capes, and Cape Ann is an interesting second Cape. I love Cape Cod. Don't get me wrong. I was going to Cape Cod when I was 2 years old, and I love it. I know it well. But I do love exploring the other Cape. You know, interestingly, we think of the Pilgrims landing and the natives and the Wampanoags being on thousands of years on Cape Cod. We think of the Pilgrims arriving in 1620. There was European settlement full-time, year-round, by the 16th century. So a century before the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth. There were not as many mini golf courses, however, on Cape Ann. That is absolutely for sure. You know, the interesting thing about Cape Ann is that it was an island until almost the 1960s. It was only the late 50s when the Abram Piatt Andrew Jr. Bridge was built, which connected Route 128 crossing the Annisquam River that connected Cape Ann. Until then, it was an island. Only one actual city on Cape Ann, which you all know well, probably America's most storied seaport in some ways. That's where there was an Icelandic group that established the fishing village year-round in the 1500s in Gloucester. Wonderful photograph by a wonderful longtime friend of mine, Mark Canigas, who I hope to see in a few weeks. Mark actually grew up next door to Gloucester in the other probably most famous location on Cape Ann, Rockport. And I'm sure you also know that that is, of course, the talk about a landmark, motif number 1. You know, motif number 1, at one time, like 40s, 50s, 60s, was often referred to as the most photographed, most painted landmark in America. That was never true. However, they certainly love to make a big deal of that in Rockport, but it is one of those landmarks. It's one of those places. It's one of those things that people outside of New England think of when they think of New England. If you're from New England, you don't think of it at all. But case in point, here is the cover of my first book, New England Notebook. You know, authors very seldom have anything to do with the art that's on their covers. So that's the last thing I would have chosen for the cover. I was shown that early on, and I thought it looked like a cookbook. But there you go. However, here's an interesting little thing about motif number one. First of all, it's not even the original motif number one anymore. The original motif number one came down in the blizzard of '78. So that's a replica. But I want to draw your attention to the little white building behind motif number one. So look at the red building that is motif number one, not the lower part, but the two-story part, right? The little thin two-story red building. That's motif number one, right? There's a white building right behind it. And for years, anytime I was driving by up there, I'd drive by and I'd look out and I'd say, oh, sometime I got to find out what that white building is. And, you know, over the years, I developed my own little theory about it, especially when the original came down in '78. I thought, well, maybe, because I couldn't remember noticing it before that. And I thought, well, maybe they have like an understudy motif now, right? Like maybe they built a replica and they've got it behind there, it's on wheels. And like if the other one comes down or burns down this time, they're prepared. They just throw some red paint on, move it up. And, you know, it's like the understudy. But it turns out that's not the case. And I got to find out what the hell it is, actually, because a few years ago, I met a wonderful new friend of mine, Gussie Contrino. Gussie is a very colorful lobsterman out of Rockport. And I found myself a few years ago standing in Rockport Harbor and talking to Gussie, and we're looking out there at the harbor. I said, I can ask you this. He said, what? I said, what is that white building right behind motif number one? He said, the white building behind motif number one? I said, yeah, what is that? He said, what is that? I said, yeah, what is that? He said, motif number two. What did you think it was? It's not motif number two. He's a funny guy, Gussie Contrino. Halibut Point. If you've ever been to Cape Ann, you may be familiar with Halibut Point. It is, it's my favorite place on Cape Ann, mostly because you can completely get away from everybody and everything. It's an abandoned granite quarry. There is still a lookout tower that's left over from World War II, where they scanned the horizon looking for German submarines during the Second World War. Today, the granite quarry is filled in. The rocks are all still spilled out all along for about 2.5 miles. You can walk along there. You can find all kinds of nooks and crannies to just get away from everything. And it is the easternmost, and in this case, northernmost point of Cape Ann, which kind of sticks out northeast. And along with Cape Porpoise, Maine, Halibut Point has the distinction of being one of the two places on the continental US that are the first to receive the rising sun from the east every day. And next door to it, I mentioned lobster before, I'll mention it briefly now, but next door to it, my favorite place to catch a sunset on Cape Ann, the lobster pool, wonderful fun to just sit out there in the big picnic tables, sit outside, beautiful place. But the reason I mention it, because as I said a moment ago, it is not lobster, but a different shellfish that has made Cape Ann famous. It is, in fact, the fried clam, mainly because the fried clam is said to have been invented on Cape Ann. So the story goes like this. Just over 100 years ago, summer of 1916, Chubby Woodman and his wife, Bessie, you may have heard of Woodman's, you may have been there. Here's the guy who started it all. Same place, that's the exact same place, footprint, where present-day Woodman's is, right on that little causeway in Essex. And Chubby and his wife, Bessie, had a little seafood joint. You know, they sold clams, quahogs, oysters. They'd shuck them, sell them whole, whatever. They sold fish. So the story goes that hot summer day, 1916, fisherman friend of theirs, probably looking to get in out of the sun, comes in, he's sitting around. And they also at Woodman's at that time, they had a fryer. And Bessie Woodman would slice up potatoes really thin, toss them in the fryer. They sold those too, kind of their version of a potato chip, you know. So the story goes, the guy's watching them work, and he says, hey, Chub, you ever tried tossing one of those clams in the fryer? And Chubby apparently said, I never have, no. And the fisherman prevailed on him to try it. So they tossed a clam into the fryer. And they took it out, shucked it, and it was inedible, like rubber. Bessie Woodman, observing this, was about to prove the truth of the famous maxim, behind every successful man, there's a smarter woman. Took the clam, shucked it before you toss it in the fryer, you dunces, dragged it through the batter she was using for the potatoes, tossed that in, waited as if she knew what was going to happen, which begs the question, why didn't you invent the clam before now? They fished it out, took a bite, rest is history. Rest is history. All of a sudden, people were lining up at Woodman's for this new taste sensation, the fried clam. And indeed, it made Cape Ann famous for fried clams, as it is today. Today, Route 133, which is the main route in and out of Cape Ann, famous, called the Clam Highway. And the three most famous clam joints on Cape Ann today, obviously Woodman's, Farnham's, also in Essex, and next door in Ipswich, the Clam Box, is said to, they're said to engage in the clam wars. Like motif number one, there's no truth to that whatsoever. I've known the owners of all three of these places. They were all the best of friends. On a busy Saturday night, any one of them running low on clams is likely to send a runner over to one of the other places, come back with a bushel of clams, some war. But I guess it's promotionally, you know, a little sexier to call it the Clam Wars. With that, we're out of Massachusetts for now. And we are heading north up to Maine, which in Massachusetts, you know, in New England, of course, that means you're going down east, which makes no sense to anybody else in the country, but it's just one of those New Englandisms that we're used to. Maine, where the mountains truly do meet the sea. I love Maine. I love coastal Maine. I love interior Maine. I love hiking in Maine, fishing, camping, you name it. I'm going to share with you my two favorite Maine factoids, okay? And then you can impress your friends later. Now, the first one you're looking at, you are absolutely looking at it. You may never have thought about it, but you're looking at it. Maine is the only state in the country that borders only one other state, New Hampshire. Of course, I think if Maine had its way, it wouldn't border any other state, but that job is taken by Hawaii. So they can't do that. My other famous Maine factoid, though, needs you're also looking at it essentially, but it takes a little bit of explanation. So think about the ragged and rocky coast of Maine. There's no other coastline in the country that is like Maine's. And when, you know, in totality, not even close. Nothing. Think about that ragged and rocky coast of Maine, the way it wends its way through all those inlets, Finger Peninsulas, the harbors, the little islands, all the way up. If you jump over the border of New Hampshire and Maine, right, from Portsmouth to Kittery, you can easily take 5 hours to get yourself up to Bar Harbor. And that's not even at the elbow there, right? Or some people call it the nose. That's not even there. You can spend another 5 hours working your way up to there, Machias, Eastport. You can easily spend 6 hours from there, heading up to the roof, Aroostook County, Kent, Van Buren, right? Now, you could fly from Logan to, say, Machias over the Gulf of Maine. About 450, 475 nautical miles, take you about 40, 45 minutes. But what if you could straighten out the coast of Maine? If you, like a balled up piece of twine, if you could just somehow magically, bang, straight line, you know what you get? Just what it says, 3,000 miles. In other words, the distance from Boston to San Francisco. I love that factor. And you feel free to use it. You don't have to attribute it to me. You can look smart. Anybody have any idea where we are? This is when I miss not being in person, like giving these little quizzes. But I'll give you a hint. No, that's not helping. Muscongas Bay, that's a household word. No. All right, I'll tell you where we are. Pemaquid Point, or Pemaquid, as they say up there. Pemaquid Point. Pemaquid is in mid-coast Maine. So you'd go up to Portland, you maybe another hour, hour and a quarter north, and you would get to Bristol. And just before you go over the water there, the causeway, and hit Topsham, you'd bang a right, go south for about 21 miles. And when the road ends, that's what you're looking at. Right dead on what you're looking at where the road ends. Keeper's House, lighthouse. Now, a lot of people I often find say the lighthouse looks familiar, which indeed it does, because it was a very, very popular lighthouse design of the 19th century. A lot of lighthouses made with exactly the same design. On the Cape, Nobska, exactly the same lighthouse. Looks just like it, right? The Nubble in Maine, exactly the same. It actually looks like a slightly slimmed down. If you took 50 feet off Boston Light and Boston Harbor, that's what you'd be looking at. However, it's not the front of the lighthouse that has always drawn me to Pemaquid. It's not the front of the lighthouse. It's what's behind the lighthouse. Because behind the lighthouse, there is like this 3.5-acre field of these really unique, you can kind of see it, these long striated rocks, which form almost like this long continuous staircase down to the water. Mascongas Bay there forms kind of a horseshoe. You can't see to the north, you can't see to the south, just straight out to the horizon. Next stop, coast of Europe. It's really a special place. I have been there all 4 seasons of the year, all times of day, different kinds of weather. If you've never been, wonderful place to check out, Pemaquid Point. So chowder, anybody? So I don't know why I torture myself and not eat before this, because this is only about the third of about 7 references to food. But I'm going to take you in on a little idiosyncrasy of mine. So starting about almost shortly after I started working at Chronicle, so just under 25 years ago, maybe 20, 22 years ago, as I traveled, I started to keep a log of the best clam chowder I tasted, because I love clam chowder. So, and then I started to think in terms of, well, I'm going to see if I can find the best clam chowder in New England. As time went on, I sampled clam chowder everywhere I went. So I said, I might as well add that too. I mean, literally coast to coast. So, I kind of had a running quest going over where was the best clam chowder in America, certainly New England. And then the quest ended, not because I lost my taste for clam chowder, but because I found it. I'm going to share it with you, but I have to swear you to secrecy. So I found it in mid-coast Maine, which surprised me, because Brunswick, which is mid-coast, where I found it, is not even on the ocean. It is kind of in a way. I mean, Buttermilk Cove comes up there about 4.5 miles, saltwater inlet. So it does technically make it on the ocean. But where I found it in Buttermilk Cove is even more unbelievable. So this is where I found it. Meet the Gurnett Trading Company. First of all, the name. Now, if somebody told me that they just bought some balsam fir, some leather moccasins, and some flannel blankets at the Gurnett Trading Company, I wouldn't bat an eye. If you told me I just had the best clam chowder I've ever tasted at the Gurnett Trading Company, it doesn't sound, there's nothing, it's not like Barnacle Billy's, there's nothing, it's not like the lobster claw, right? But this is where I found it. And to make matters even more amazing, in its first life, the Gurnett Trading Company was a tiny little 2-car repair garage. They cleaned it out very well. And it was the dream. It was the dream of a wonderful couple, Julie and Brian Soper, both commercial fishermen. Julie was a fisherwoman for many, many years, decided about 10, 12 years ago she wanted to get in off the water. Who can blame her? She was a great cook, had a book full of recipes. Brian is still a commercial fisherman, commercial scalper, actually. So he still scalps almost year round. And, funny thing, you talk about fresh. So I was in there one day, and he was bringing in scallops in the morning. And Julie said, oh, he does that generally once a day. So he may be out scalloping at 6 in the morning. He may be done by 8:30, right? So gets his gear all put away, tied up, gear put away, leaves the dock, let's say, at 9:30. He's over dropping off a bushel of scallops to Julie at the trading company at what, 10:30, 10:45. At 11:30, if you ordered scallops for lunch, the scallops you're ordering may have been sitting on the ocean floor like 90 minutes earlier. That's fresh. But I digress, because it wasn't scallops. It wasn't scallops I was interested in. It was this baby. It was chowder. It was about 6-7 years ago, maybe. My longtime Chronicle photographer and I, Carl Vieira, we were doing some stories in Brunswick, and it was lunchtime. We're looking for a place to have lunch. We drove by this place. I'd never seen it, never heard of it. We figured, what the hell? It was a nice June day. There were tables outside. All right, so I think we both ordered like a tuna roll and a bowl of chowder. That was like par for the course. And the chowder came out first. So I'm not going to say that I took a spoonful and heard the strains of heavenly music in my head and the Hallelujah chorus, but something very close. I took one spoonful. I put my spoon down. I said, did you try this? And he did. And we both looked at each other. I said, that's it. Game over. What made it so amazing? You know what? I'm sure all of you love chowder. Here's my take on clam chowder. It's not what people put in it that generally screws it up. I always get that wrong. It's what they put in, they shouldn't put in it, that screws it up, right? So like potatoes, cardinal sin of clam chowder. Like potatoes? That's excellent. Get yourself a baked potato. I think they make something called potato leek soup. Never tried it, but I hear it, a lot of potatoes. Don't gum up my works with potato. Clams are the star, right? Greenery, you like greenery? Scallions, celery, order a salad, okay? I want the clams to star. And this thing was full of fresh clams. I'm just going to torture myself if I keep going. But now you know where to get the best clam chowder. You're already, we're 15 minutes in, you know Maine's 2 most famous factoids and where to get the best clam chowder in the world. Good night. You're welcome. No, I'll keep going. So we're done in Maine. We're done in Maine, and we are heading out of Maine. You know, if you exit Maine through its western mountains, the western mountains of Maine become the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So why not start at the top? Actually, roof of New England, highest point east of the Mississippi River, Mount Washington. Not sure why I'm not wearing a hat. I know it was about 12 below zero, but there was no wind. That's probably it. There was no wind at all. You know how you can tell up above timberline if there's no wind? If there's wind, you will absolutely see along the ridges, you will see what they call little snow ghosts, right? Snow dust is swirling around. There's not any of that present. So I can tell you there was no wind, but it was plenty cold. And there is my longtime photographer, Carl Vieira. We're on the summit of Mount Washington there. But it's not Mount Washington. I just want to throw that picture in. It's not Mount Washington that I want to talk to you about. It's a different mountain. And it's about something that isn't even there. So with that riddle, let's go to Franconia Notch. I think arguably one of the 2 prettiest places in all of New England. Franconia Notch, where what is not there once looked out over the entire notch as if he owned the place. Profile Lake is still there, which got its name from reflecting what is no longer there. And I know all of us of a certain age know, I'm talking about the old man of the mountain, gone but not forgotten. So lest you wonder why it is that I'm dredging up golden oldies about things that aren't even there anymore, because there is something that's there now that allows you to re-experience the old man. I don't know if you've checked it out, but I'm going to explain it to you. You know, the thing that was, if you think about the first time that you saw the old man of the mountain, for many people, I find when of a certain age, granted, but if you ask them about seeing the old man, it's a childhood experience usually. And it was about sort of this buildup because you were generally driving along, right? Route 93 North, which was the best place to see it. And maybe a parent, maybe a sibling would be saying, it's not there yet. Don't look yet. And then suddenly it was like, now, right? Look now, because you only had a few seconds to see it. And then it was going to disappear. It's not that the rock face disappeared. It was an optical illusion. Oh, there was a face, all right. But it looked nothing like that, except from that one spot at a certain altitude down below, which is about 2,400 feet, and at the exact right angle. And once you were past that point, it was gone. Because what we didn't see from the ground, you know, when we were younger, this was not like a one-dimensional sculpture. It was a group of 7 separate rock outcroppings, which taken together, viewed together from the right angle at the right altitude, looked like that. If you were above the old man looking down, looked nothing like that. If you were at the same altitude, looking right at it as if you were right cheek by jowl, nothing like that. If you were in a helicopter right in front of his nose, you wouldn't be able to find the nose because it looked nothing like that. So we didn't see that from the ground, right? You know what else you didn't see from the ground? This. From the ground, we never saw all that had been done for the past 75 years to help shore up and preserve the old man, to try to keep it up there. Because the folks who did this knew that the old man was always going to come down. The irony is that the rock face was up there only because other rocks had fallen away and left this 1,000 years ago, 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 years ago. Who the hell knows? A long time ago. But it was only there because other rocks had fallen away. And the folks who were trying to shore up the old man, they knew for certain that the rest of the face was coming down too. All those rocks that were there and formed the rock face were only part of rocks that didn't completely fall away the last time there had been a major rock fall on the Cannon Mountain cliffs. But it was going to come down. It was going to come down. And no amount of those huge steel turnbuckles, huge foot width steel cables, concrete poured between the cracks, no amount of anything was going to keep it from coming down. And on May 3rd, 2003, it came down. It was a perfect storm in a way, literally. It had been an unusually warm late spring, early spring really, in the White Mountains in 2003. Temperatures had reached almost 70 degrees in late April, unheard of in the Whites. Been torrential downpours. And then May 2nd, cleared out. The temperature dropped more than 40 degrees in less than 24 hours, fell below freezing. So all that water in the cracks froze. What does ice do? Ice expands. And that was it. About 1:30 in the morning, it came down. And people were devastated. People were devastated, especially in New Hampshire. People spontaneously gathered around Profile Lake, and there was this sense of almost like, you know, this family, this beloved person who was known and dear to everybody had died. Perhaps nobody, in some ways, was more disconsolate than my late wonderful friend Dick Hamilton, who I always joked was the other old man of the mountain. Dick was for many, many years head of tourism in the White Mountains. So his office was in Lincoln, just south of the Notch. His home was in Littleton, just north of the Notch. So he drove through the Notch twice a day, every day. And he told me once, he said, you know, I don't care whose name is on my check. I know who's responsible for my job, and it's him. And he said every night he'd drive home and he'd look up there in the darkness and he'd say, good night, boss. And Dick was made head of a commission appointed by the governor when the old man fell, to head up a commission to look at how to commemorate the old man of the mountain, how to memorialize. There was a feeling that it had to be commemorated in some way. And they got all kinds of proposals, some of them absolutely absurd. Thank goodness they didn't happen. There was a proposal to form a exact replica out of fiberglass of the old man in the same spot. Thank God that didn't happen. But Dick, in his infinite wisdom, was able to approve the winning proposal. And it was winning in more ways than one, which I'll explain to you. Maybe some of you have seen this because the profilers have been in place for about 5 years now. And they are the genius of Ron Magers. Ron, lovely guy, incredibly skilled toy maker out of Newburyport, Mass. And he came up with this thing he called the profiler. And the profiler basically resembles an inverted hockey stick standing on the stick end, right? With the blade up in the air, right? Kind of like this, right? So here's what they are, like that. And they're pointing up at the Cannon Mountain cliffs. But there's no electrics involved. They don't project anything. There's no app that you download to use them. It is ingenious because what Ron did was he recreated not only a way to see the old man exactly as he looked in the exact same spot up on the Cannon Mountain cliffs, but as ingeniously, more so, he recreates the experience you had of having to get yourself in just exactly that right spot. Because on the blade of the profiler, in miniature, unbelievably, are the exact 7 stone outcroppings that form the face of the old man. So I'll hold this up against my camera, and you can see from the very smallest one, which actually ends up forming the very tip of that beak-like nose of the old man, all 7 outcroppings, right? So when you look at it and get yourself in position and put it right up there on the cliffs, there you go. It's like he's up there again. So it's really just an ingenious way. I am so impressed with what he did. And I've been there when people and watched people once with Ron, as people look at them and they're like, how do you use this thing? And, you know, they're getting themselves in position. And then you always hear somebody say, oh my God, he's there, right? It's wonderful, just wonderful. So as you know, New Hampshire is about more than just mountains. It's also about rivers and lakes. They even got a little itty bitty tiny little seaport up there. And it's also about woods. They don't call it the Great North Woods for nothing. There are a lot of woods in New Hampshire. That's not surprising. What is surprising to me is what I discovered for the first time just this past fall when I was doing some stories in southern New Hampshire. And that's what makes this extraordinary, is where this is. Well, first of all, what this is extraordinary, wherever you find it anywhere in the world. But the fact that it's where it is in southern New Hampshire is unbelievable to me, to anybody. This is only 25 minutes from New Hampshire's biggest city, Nashua. So 25 minutes due west of Nashua in Wilton, New Hampshire, is that rarest of things in New England. I don't even know how to phrase it, how rare this is. An old growth forest. You know, for 300-400 years, with settlement in New England, the forests in southern New England disappeared. On Cape Cod, more than any place. You know, in Thoreau's visit to Cape Cod, I've always been struck by this, and I tried to find some of the spots that he viewed this, because he described how having all the trees having been cut down for timber and wood and so forth on the Cape, that you could look widthwise in many places across the Cape, water to water on each side, where you would never have been able to do that, as he said, 25, 40, 50, 100 years ago, because it would have been covered with trees. These were all gone. So an old growth forest are trees that basically have never been cut down. And in southern New England, that's incredible, because as I said, going back 350, 400 years, they were cut down for ship masts. They were cut down more than anything to build with. Homes, heat, right? Then paper, then telephone poles. But here in the Sheldrick Forest Preserve, they are still there. Old growth trees. Old growth trees are defined as being at least 200 feet high. How high is 200 feet high? 200 feet high for a tree is full neck extension, meaning you have to bring your neck all the way back as far as it goes, right? As far back as you can tilt your head to look up 200 feet. And they have to be at least 250 to 350 years old. So the trees covering about 213 acres, right? Hundreds and hundreds of these old growth trees in the Sheldrick Forest Preserve predate the American Revolution. So Paul Revere could have ridden his horse up there and seen the same trees you're looking at today. You know, the Nature Conservancy owns and manages the Sheldrick Forest Preserve. How they came to own it, I'm going to tell you in a moment, because that's the whole story. But you know, John Sawhill, who's one of the founders of the Nature Conservancy, I love this quote. It was one of my favorite quotes before last fall when I found these trees. But he once said, a society is defined not just by what it creates and builds, but by what it refuses to destroy. And that goes to the heart of the Sheldrick Forest Preserve, because it's only there because one man refused to destroy it. Literally, one man refused to cut it down. Literally. Swift Corwin is a professional forester. Now, he also knows all about managing trees and forests and preserving them. He also knows all about cutting trees down. And 20 years ago, he was hired to cut a lot of trees down in the Sheldrick Forest Preserve. So the Sheldrick family had owned this land for about 200 years, and about 20, 25 years ago, they sold it. New owner wants to monetize his investment, totally. So he wants to sell 100% of the timber rights, cut it all down. He wants to turn over the ground once the trees are gone for the gravel rights. And when that's all done, he wants to retail it and sell the real estate. Okay, maximum usage. Swift Corwin and a team of foresters were hired by this guy to go in and tag them. Tag them all. Tag them all. Tagging them means they're coming down. So a week and a half in, as Swift Corwin, you can see here last fall talking with him in the forest, as he described it, about a week and a half in, he realized these are old growth trees. These are old growth. These trees are 300 years old. And he couldn't cut them down. He said, I can't do it. But he said, furthermore, I didn't want to just say I can't do it, so get someone else. He said, I wanted to find a way that he wouldn't be able to cut them down either. So he went to the Nature Conservancy. And together, they worked with this landowner to come up with a plan that would perfectly compensate him. Look, could he have made a few more bucks if he had sold every single tree, turned over every piece of ground, and sold every piece of gravel? Undoubtedly. So give the guy a little credit too. He realized, okay, didn't know they were old growth, accepted the offer. Today, completely public access. If you ever have a chance to check it out. The only other place I felt like that, seriously, is the Muir Woods in America, looking up at these trees that are just like ship masts, but sitting right there in the ground. And if you go, don't miss the hand tree. It's so wonderful watching little kids scamper up in there, and it looks like the tree is holding them for a selfie. So with that, we're out of New Hampshire and into Vermont on Route 100, probably the most beautiful byway in Vermont. And might as well start at the top of Vermont too. Vermont's most highest peak, Mount Mansfield, home, of course, of Stowe, where I've skied many times. A lot of people don't realize that Mount Mansfield also has a stone face, a rock profile of an old man. Didn't know that? You're looking at it. Winter's not the best time to see it. How about now? Little forehead. It's got a nose. It's got an upper lip, lower lip. Got a chin. They even throw in an Adam's apple. Here, let me flip it for you. It's a very long face. Yeah, I always say, you know what? The stone face of Mount Mansfield pretty much succeeds in just making you miss the old man of the mountain that much more. However, speaking of skiing, I want to share with you something that is kind of unbelievable about the year 2020, which I think in the future will become like the Voldemort of years, right? It'll be the year that we don't want to say its name. But this was a beautiful day in 2020. Granted, it was 2 months before the pandemic descended, first week or two of 2020. But it has to do with skiing, but it's not really about the skiing. I love to ski. I've been skiing since I was 5 or 6 years old. I say I love to ski. I don't love what skiing has become. I'm fortunate enough to be able to ski a few times a year and afford it. That's what I don't love about the industry of skiing. I don't just not love it. I hate it. I hate that it has become prohibitively expensive for too many people. Many people can't even think about skiing. And so that turns me off about the industry. However, as I said, this was not about skiing. This was about a third place that I had never thought about before, right? So I'm very big on third places in American life, of which one of my passions, public libraries, is one of the best, absolute best examples of a third place. So are diners, so are general stores. A third place, for those who don't know, is, it's not home and it's not work. It is a third place. It's where communities gather, right? So you're not working, you're not at home. So they're places where you might gather. And it's places where communities become communities, right? And I never thought of a ski area kind of functioning as a third place, but that's what Northeast Slopes is. And I just found it out last January, a year ago, this past January. Nobody makes a dime at Northeast Slopes. Why? Because it's owned by the community. It's entirely run by volunteers. You know, East Corinth, Vermont, up in Orange County, Vermont. So that's kind of East Central Vermont. Very low income area. Lot of folks in 5 or 6 towns, all surrounding East Corinth, live below the poverty line. There's a lot of problems with malnutrition up there. Yeah, it's not Appalachia, it's Vermont. And it's a tough area. So this makes it all the more amazing that this little ski area exists. And it exists to let everybody ski and gather, have a good time. In summer, they have concerts. It goes back a long way. It goes back till the 1930s. In fact, its original rope tow is today the oldest continuously operating ski lift in North America. But as I mentioned, this is an area of Vermont where, for the most part, more than 99% of these families would not be able to afford to ski. They would not be able to afford to buy ski equipment for their kids. But at Northeast Slopes, no matter. All the kids ski for free. Ski for free, don't have equipment, no problem. All the equipment is donated. I just love that. I love that. And I spent one of the best days of my life skiing at Northeast Slopes. I got to hang out with Wade Peterson, who is right now the chief volunteer responsible for running things. How much money did I spend? As you may or may not know, if you ski at a major ski area today in New England, the Rockies, wherever, you're going to spend a minimum of $100 just for a lift ticket. That's not to mention the obscenely priced food that you may have to buy as well. Know what I spent at Northeast Slopes? Did I spend $20? No, I did not spend $20. I spent $16. I spent $10 for a half-day lift ticket, and I spent another $6 for a delicious, their signature nor'easter cheeseburger, and might have been one of the best days I've ever spent on the snow. With that, we're out of Vermont, out of the North Country. We're heading south. We're going to re-enter Massachusetts through the Berkshires. I love the Berkshires. Maybe some of you do too. I always think there's a few things that people think of, and not much more when you think of the Berkshires. I think a lot of people think of Lenox, right? Summer home of the BSO. I think a lot of people think of Stockbridge, probably the most famous location in the Berkshires. You think of Stockbridge, you think of Norman Rockwell, who spent the last 20 years of his life living and working in Stockbridge. There is Norman Rockwell at work in his studio. That studio is now, as you can see in the color photograph, on the grounds and open to the public at the Norman Rockwell Museum. Maybe some of you have been. There is a painting of Stockbridge that Norman Rockwell painted. You know, if you know anything about Rockwell, obviously, you know he's a very famous American painter, probably America's most gifted illustrator, all those magazine covers. You may know that he was very famous for painting almost entirely, like 100%, relying on real life models, which led to great stories later in life of people in his photographs meeting each other and so forth again. Here's what a lot of people don't know about Rockwell and the last 20 years of his life in Stockbridge. The last 20 years of his life, Rockwell devoted a lot of his work to focusing on some of America's social issues. And the social issue that fascinated Rockwell most was the issue of race in America. For instance, in 1964, he painted, I think, one of his most moving photographs of all, the problem we all live with, right? Racism. And in it, he depicts a very, very brave 8-year-old girl, little Ruby Bridges of New Orleans, who is following behind 2 big burly US Marshals, and she's on her way in to begin her school day by integrating a segregated school. What'd you do today? You know, 3 years later, Rockwell painted another, one of my favorite paintings of his, New Kids in the Neighborhood. This was for a special edition of Life magazine focusing on race in America. And this went with an inside story about one facet of race in America, the desegregation of America's suburban neighborhoods This is Rockville, Illinois. Families of color moving in. I want to draw your attention to the young African-American gentleman in the far right or far left. I never know how that might change at home, right? But long sleeve white sweatshirt, plaid shorts, baseball glove behind his back, right? Ray Gunn, W-R-A-Y-G-U-N-N. How great a name is Ray Gunn? I would have paid my parents a small stipend monthly to change my name to Ray Gunn Reinstein, but Ray got the name. Now, you might be wondering, how did he end up modeling for Norman Rockwell? Good question. There were not a lot of families of color living in Stockbridge in 1967. Frankly, there aren't a whole lot more today, but there were fewer in 1967. However, Ray Gunn's grandfather was social friends with Norman Rockwell. They hung out together. At the end of the day, Ray Gunn's grandfather would often go over to Norman Rockwell's studio. They'd put their feet up, smoke their pipes, have a drink, talk about the day. So it must have come to pass that in 1967, Ray Gunn's grandfather must have been listening as Norman Rockwell explained to him, I'm about to do this commission. I need to find like a teenage black kid. Any ideas? And Ray Gunn's grandfather must have said, do I have any ideas? My grandson Ray is 13. And that was it. So he posed for Norman Rockwell. He was 13 years old in 1967. No longer 13 when I met Ray in 2006. And at that point, he was giving tours at the Rockwell Museum. And, I had him stand in front of his picture as we were doing the interview. And I said to him at one point when we were finished, I said, Ray, I got a question. I have one more question. I said, what occurs to me as we're sitting here, you are somebody who gets to do something that very few people in the entire world get to do. He said, what's that? Very, very droll guy, Ray. And he said, what's that? I said, you come to work every day and you pass right by a world famous painting by a world famous artist and you're in it. I said, how does that feel? And he looked at the painting just like that. He looked at the painting and he looked back at me and he looked back at the painting and he looked back at me and he said, well, now that you mention it, I guess it's nice to know that someplace in the world where you're always 13, right? And he walked away. And in my first book, New England Notebook, whole chapter on the Berkshires, and I go into more details about Ray Gunn and his interesting life. And the chapter is entitled, appropriately enough, Forever 13. With that, we are almost back to our starting point, Boston. However, if you've been doing the math at home, you might have noticed that I called this a New England road trip. And you may be thinking, the last time I checked, there were 6 New England states, and you just visited just 4. True story. However, here's another little idiosyncrasy of mine. I really like to make clean circles when I travel. Clean loop. Ask my dog. My dog could talk, he does the same thing when he takes me for a walk. So I didn't want to kind of like jump south, go back north. So I would never slight my friends in Rhode Island and Connecticut, though. So very quickly, a quick love song to Rhode Island, Connecticut. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing. The number 221. I've done this in Texas. I won't say everybody. If you stop 10 people, I would say 2 or 3 people in Texas would know. If you said, what does the number 221 mean in Texas? I would say 2 or 3 people out of 10 would say, oh, that's the number of times, what's the state? Rhode Island would fit into Texas. That's true. That's true. But you know what? I like to take Texans down a peg every chance I get because frankly, they're a little bit too big for their britches. There are things you can find, as big as Texas is, there are things that you can't find in Texas that you can find in Rhode Island. For instance, authentic Rhode Island calamari sauce. You know what else you can't find in Texas, no matter how hard you try? An authentic coffee cabinet, which is Rhode Island speak for a coffee milkshake. There is no better place to get a coffee cabinet than at Delecta's. They have Delecta's in Warren, Rhode Island. Amazing, untouched, 150-year-old soda fountain. Wonderful. And interesting, Warren, Rhode Island is its own claim to fame because Warren, Rhode Island turns out to be like the little Russian nesting doll of towns, right? So those little Russian nesting dolls, where you keep taking it off the top, and they get smaller, 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 smaller. Warren, Rhode Island is the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state in America. There you go. So yeah, Texas likes to say, don't mess with Texas. You may know Rhode Islanders. Frankly, I wouldn't mess with the average Rhode Islander either. Connecticut, I'm going to go counterintuitive here because this is something you may not think of at all with Connecticut. You might. But it's the first thing I always think of. It's the first thing I would think of because my thoughts generally turn to food, pizza. Now, I won't say I've had the same kind of quest with pizza that I had with clam chowder. Same time, love pizza. Who doesn't? I have eaten pizza all over the country. I have eaten pizza all over the world. I have eaten pizza all over Italy. And while I have had great pizza elsewhere, including Italy, I can't say that I have ever had dramatically better pizza than I have had in New Haven, Connecticut. Because New Haven, Connecticut is like the definition of an embarrassment of riches. Because on Worcester Street, which is in the heart of the Italian section of New Haven, you will find, bookending Worcester Street, the two best pizzerias in America. Frank Pepe opened up his pizzeria, immigrant from Naples, Italy, 1920s, late 1920s, opens up his pizzeria, serving the authentic Neapolitan pizza of his youth. He hires his nephew, Sal Consiglio. After 17 years, Sal knows everything there is to make in pizza. He opens up his own place just down the street. You know, many people call it a family feud. There's no feud anymore. Trust me. But I did profile them in Wicked Piss because it does sound like it would be a wonderful family feud. It may have been early on. Now it's just an embarrassment of riches. And there is Bobby Consiglio, Sally's son, still working the original brick oven at Sally's. So with that, before I finish, I did mention I would share with you my favorite diners. For in the last minute and 30 seconds, I'm going to quickly share with you my favorite diners in the 4 states that we spent a little time in. So I love pie. My favorite pie, banana cream pie. Best banana cream pie in New England, hands down, the Agawam. Route 1A, Raleigh, Massachusetts. In Maine, 2 diners. One is in Waldoboro. Partly, I love Moody's because it's the best diner sign. Well, second best, as you'll see, second best diner sign I've ever seen. Thirdly, they make whoopie pies there, which is Maine's official state dessert, the size of a baby's head. Thirdly, if you ever see that cookbook, which can be hard to find sometimes, What's Cooking at Moody's, get it. Get it. Some great recipes there. My other favorite diner in Maine, in Biddeford, the Palace Diner. A couple of foodies couldn't afford to open up a place in Portland. Who can? Very expensive. But they did the next best thing. They created my favorite kind of diner in Biddeford, the Palace. What's my favorite kind of diner? A diner that's been saved. And they reopened it, and it's fantastic. In New Hampshire, a diner that combines 2 of my favorite things, great diner food and a side of politics. The Red Arrow, nobody's run for president in the last 70 years without campaigning assiduously at the Red Arrow Diner. And there we have former President Barack Obama chatting up some folks in 2008 at the Red Arrow. In Vermont, also 2 diners, both in southern Vermont. The Chelsea Royal in West Brattleboro, partly because that's also a diner sign that doesn't get any better than that. And the Country Girl in Chester, another one of my favorite kinds of diners. Couple, great story. This couple had a dream. They worked in the food biz, never owned a place. They dreamed of opening up a diner. They opened the Country Girl 7 months before the pandemic. So here's hoping and praying that they get to stick it out, tough it out, and survive in Chester, Vermont. And with that, we'll finish with my favorite diner in the world, the Boulevard. The Boulevard Diner, what is there to say? It is probably the only diner in the world that still exists right next door to where it was built. You talk about an original, authentic Worcester dining car. The Boulevard sits on Shrewsbury Street, an eighth of a mile from where it was constructed just over 100 years ago. You want to talk about a diner sign? That sign for me just says it all by saying little. Right? It doesn't say breakfast all day. It doesn't say come in, we're open. It just says diner. It's warm. It's inviting. You feel like you're at home. And as we finish back in Boston, lights of Fenway Park, more lights that we hope, just like the lights at the Falmouth Public Library, coming on again, inviting people back in, safe at home. I can't wait for public libraries to have in-person meetings again so we can do this in person. I truly, truly, truly miss it. And with that, we are back. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to leave this up here because if anybody is interested in obtaining any of my books, boom, all you got to do is go to my website. If you would like a signed copy, can't do that through my website, but if you'd like a signed copy, my email address there, shoot me an email. I'll shoot you an email back in one email exchange. I'll tell you how to do it, and I will ship it to you for free. And with that, we look at a blank screen. That doesn't work. With that, I'll leave that up there. I'll invite Jill back in, and I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
Okay, so if you have a question, and thank you so much, Ted. That was really fun. If you have a question, you can put it into the chat now, and we will share that. I'll share that question with Ted.
No food questions, though, because I haven't eaten yet, and I'm dying here. No, you can ask a food question.
Any questions?
Anybody? People were not madly scribbling away in the chat, huh?
Not yet, but maybe we'll have something in a moment.
Well, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go have dinner, and then I'll be right back.
Okay, wait a minute. Here we go. They're coming in now. Okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay, here you go. Does the Miss Flo Diner still exist?
Absolutely. The Miss Flo Diner in Little Florence, little village of Northampton. I'm here to tell you, just less than a year ago, late last summer, I did a piece, was down the Cape actually, on the Shining Sea Trail. I did a piece about rail trails in New England, mostly Massachusetts. And when I was out in Northampton, I stopped at the Miss Flo. And the Miss Flo is open. It is doing well and it has a new owner, lovely lady. And so I'm so happy to report. Often it's not the case when people ask about certain diners, but in this case, you're in luck. The Miss Flo is doing just fine. Okay, and here's another question for you. What is the length of the Massachusetts coastline? You know, there's always some smart aleck who wants to ask me something I don't know. Very, very, now, I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. See, I Google very, very fast. So while I'm sitting here and going, so interesting you should ask. You know, I was thinking about that yesterday. And you know what it is? I'm not going to do that, though. I'm going to tell you, I have no idea. I have no idea. But I have no doubt that you can call your local reference librarian and you'll get the answer to that. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting you should say that, Jill, because you know what I love to tell people? I didn't make this saying up, but I love it. Speaking of Googling and your local librarian, I love the saying, if you want an answer, you can Google it. If you want the right answer, ask a librarian. Because librarians, unlike Google, will curate your answer for you. Am I right? I couldn't agree more. So here's another one for you. I think you can answer. Well, I don't know. This could be tough. What's your favorite hike? Oh, that's a great question. That's a toughie because there are so many. That's a great question. So one of my favorite hikes is in the Sandwich Range in New Hampshire. I can't remember whether they call it Sandwich, if it's just the Sandwich Mountain Trail. Heads out of Center Sandwich, right? It's a beautiful trail. There's an old remains of a small plane that crashed up there about 70 years ago. That's one of my favorite hikes. I love the Greylock, the Mount Greylock Trail in the Berkshires. I love some trails that are really not deep woods or mountainous trails, but that are kept by the trustees of reservations. There's one that's only about 6 miles from my house in Dover, Massachusetts. It comes out to a beautiful place where you get a gorgeous, gorgeous view of a hilltop of the skyline of Boston. There are some beautiful hikes in Maine. that I love. Yeah, that's a toughie. I love some parts of the Long Trail in Vermont for that matter, particularly between Montpelier and Stowe in that part of it. But that's a great question. It's really hard for me to pick one.
I think this is another hard question for you, given your audience this evening. What's your favorite place in Falmouth?
That's not a hard question. The Falmouth Public Library, silly.
What would be your second favorite?
The Falmouth Public Library. That's a good question. Next.
We'll let you get away with that one. What is the best bookstore in New England?
Oh, any of the ones that carry my books. What are the best bookstores in New England? That's a great question. That's a great question. So there's a great bookstore. Now, naturally, I'm blanking on the names of some of them. It's a great bookstore in Rockport. I'm ashamed of myself. I'm blanking on some names. But there's a great old-time bookstore in Rockport. For many, many years, right in Newton, there was a wonderful bookstore called the New England Booksmith. And unfortunately, they finally had to move to a smaller place. Now they've got they survived to some extent in this little strip mall in Newton. But what was amazing about the New England Mobile Book Fair, what am I saying? The New England Mobile Book Fair was that if you had ever been there, there was no order to anything. They claimed that there was an order, that things were organized. There wasn't. So it was wonderful to just watch people browsing and rummaging through books. But unfortunately, that's no longer the same. Wonderful bookstore in Peterborough, New Hampshire, that's right next door to the Peterborough Diner. Another one, I'm blanking on its name. So I'm sorry about that. But anyway, those are a few that come to mind.
We've been given the answer. Someone has kindly told us now that the coast of Massachusetts is.
I figured someone would.
192 miles.
192? Got it.
And do you have a favorite seaside location in Maine?
Other than Buttermilk Cove and the Gwinnett Trading Company, did I not rhapsodize quite enough? Somebody wasn't listening. So aside from that, I do like Red Zeets in Wisconsin. Red Zeets is a little shack. It's not eat in, but it's a little, you drive, you don't drive up, you drive up and get out, walk up to the counter. It's a little shack. But Red Zeets is a classic right there near the causeway in Wisconsin. That's another one that comes to mind. Most of the rest of the stuff in the South is a little bit too touristy for my taste, but they have their fans, no question about it. But that's another one, Red Zeets, for sure.
Okay, I believe you have now answered everybody's question. And terrific. I thank you all for being here this evening, and especially delightful to see Ted during the pandemic, for which we are getting to the other side of, we hope.
We are getting to the other side.
And I am delighted to remind you all that the Falmouth Public Library is once again, our buildings are open, our East Branch is open, our North Branch is open, and the main library are all open. So please stop by. We had lots of people visit yesterday. There is a half-an-hour time limit for your time in the library. And of course, you need to wear a mask, but nonetheless, we would love to see you. And it's been a delight, I have to say, this just in the last 2 days, seeing so many people that, because I actually was not outside doing curbside pickup, I was inside answering questions. And so it was a real delight to see so many of you who I had not seen since December. So I'm delighted that we're reopened. And Ted, thank you so much. It really, it almost makes, as I say, it makes us feel like, you know, things are returning, having you
little by little.
in the library, as it were.
Well, I'm delighted that the library is reopening. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Jill, thanks as always for your wonderful, wonderful help and assistance. Good luck with the library reopening. Everybody go to the library. And I know many of you will. And as Jill mentioned, I do have a new book coming out next fall. And I dearly, dearly look forward to coming to speak in person in Falmouth.
We would love that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Ted. And we'll see you at the library.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye now. Be safe. Bye, Jill.
Bye-bye.